So I wanted to get my head around what a way to approach art and science together, since I don't usually think about these things. So I looked for some quotes, and the first one's by Joseph Campbell, who you might remember was with Bill Moyers in a TV special on PBS, and his definition of art is the function of the artist is the mythologization of the culture and the world. So something about making myth is what artists are supposed to do. And kind of the scientist's viewpoint comes from Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. And he defended Darwin against all the critics. And his definition or his discussion of science is the great tragedy of science is the slaying of beautiful hypotheses by ugly facts. Okay, so we have these kind of two views that I think bring together things that we're going to talk about today. So this is a bowerbird bower, okay, and bowerbirds build and decorate unique and remarkable structures called bowers. So this is a western bowerbird bower in the western part of Australia. You can see the bower with decorations in front. And these are just remarkable structures. And let me do this one. And there are two major types of bowers. There are the maypole kinds of bowers that are in the second row, and then there's the avenue bowers, which are down below. And these are thought to be in two different groups of bowerbirds, but nobody was sure when we started working on these about 30 years ago. And this is a bower bird display court of a tooth-billed bowerbird, a species that doesn't build a bower. And this is going to be useful for what we're going to be talking about in just a bit. So there's a whole variety of kinds of bowers and things that different bowerbirds do. And what we want to do is to kind of explore what's going on with bowerbirds and why bowerbirds build them. This is one of the Vogelkop bowerbirds in Western New Guinea in Irian Jaya or West Irian. That bower is 6 feet across and 6 feet tall, and it has all the decorations in front. There's quite a sight when you first come up on one of these. It just blows your mind. Darwin and others have long been curious about bower origins, and there's been a lot of, a long history of speculation about bower evolution and with little factual support. So what we wanted to do about 30 years ago when I started on this project is actually go out into the field and figure out why bowerbirds build bowers. And the reason for that was if you're interested in sexual selection, which was also a controversial theory at the time, the thinking was if you could solve this very difficult problem, then you would advance sexual selection theory and also answer an interesting question about bowerbirds. Now, sexual selection is responsible for all kinds of beautiful traits in a variety of animals. I'm biased towards birds, so you see a lot of the plumage traits that are associated with birds of paradise, widow birds, lyrebirds, and other kinds of organisms, including fish. So this evolution of these fancy structures is something that biologists are very interested in and represents a very important problem that we want to try to solve and understand. All right, let me just give you a little background on sexual selection. There are two basic elements to Darwin's hypothesis. One hypothesis is male-male competition, where males fight it out for females. This is well supported, no controversy. Everybody agrees that it happens. Female choice was controversial at the time Darwin proposed it, but it's generally accepted now. There are three versions of female choice that we want to be familiar with. One is the transfer of material benefits. So males might give parental care and females might choose males because of that. There's proximate benefits. Males might give females protection and females might choose males because of this protection from threat that males might give females. And then there's the third aspect, which is genetic benefits, which certainly 30 years ago was very controversial and now in one sense has been kind of resolved in that it is generally accepted now that in certain cases, at least, females choose certain males because they're high quality sires and more likely to make healthy and fit offspring. Now, there's an alternative hypothesis, one that David talked about and seems to like a lot in his book, and that's called runaway sexual selection. And the idea of runaway sexual selection is that arbitrary female biases increase mating advantage for preferred males. So this traits run away, and very often when people cite runaway sexual selection, the evidence that they use is there are these big, huge structures or fancy structures that animals have, and these fancy structures are thought to be products of runaway. But there's no obvious proof. Now, the model itself is fairly difficult, and we'll talk more about what's involved in that model. But what I want to do is go on and really address the question of why bowerbirds build bowers, given this kind of set of explanations. Now, one of the features of this biological view of things is this kind of adaptationist perspective, this idea that traits are functional. And some people will argue, like David did, that traits are not functional. These sexually selected traits are just arbitrary. And others will say, yes, they are very functional. Now, many biologists like the idea that the traits are functional if they're associated with reproduction, because lots of genes are transferred during reproduction. This is kind of the time when the rubber hits the road, so to speak, so you really need to do well. So in the case of a bowerbird, one male may copulate with 25 different females in a year and sire their offspring. So it is a big deal if you do it right or don't do it right, because it really affects the transfer of genes in evolution. So this is a very big problem, and that's why biologists like me like the adaptationist hypothesis. Now, one of the first things we wanted to do was figure out how bowerbirds are related to one another, and this is the family tree of the bowerbirds. We used 9 different genes to build this tree, and what we found out was at the very top, there's a cluster of those are the maypole building bowerbirds, the ones that build the huts and things like that. In the center, there are the monogamous bowerbirds, the ones that don't build any bower at all. They're monogamous, males and females pair up. And then at the bottom, there are the avenue building bowerbirds. So why this family tree was kind of interesting to us in particular, because it suggests two origins for the for the evolution of bowerbirds. In other words, the most parsimonious reconstruction of traits on this tree is that bower building evolved twice. And if anybody wants to discuss this later, I can explain it to you, but it's a little complicated. Okay, now to understand what bowerbirds are up to, we rigged up automated camera systems and we monitor the bowers. And why bowerbirds are actually good to study in this regard is that they mate in the bower. So if you put a camera on the bower and then you just take movies of everything that happens at the bower, if you have a sensor that turns the camera on, then you can take the whole history of what happens at a bower through the whole mating season and understand it. And then you can compare all the different males. So we run cameras at about 30 different bowers, sometimes up to 40 at our study site. Now, what I'd like to do here, if I can get my mouse running, hit it. All right. This is a satin bowerbird courting a female. Now, this male is one courting a female who's very relaxed in the bower. You can just watch her. She's there. You can turn up the sound. I'll talk over it. He's going to go around and copulate with her quickly. Now, these courtships usually last about 15 minutes to a half hour. And so you've seen sex. That's good. Right? And now this is another courtship, and you're going to see, but this guy isn't going to get any. Don't worry. And what you're seeing here is a nervous female. Okay? So the reason I'm showing this to you is because I want you to see that the females aren't all that comfortable, at least a lot of them, when they come to the bower. They're kind of jumping in and out of the bower. And when he does his buzz, you'll see her jump back. See how she jumps out when he does his buzz? So we have this hypothesis that what the bower is there for is actually to make the female comfortable. So it's functional. In other words, that she's nervous there and he wants to calm her down and he wants to do things to make her feel good about being there because he wants her to see his display. And if she's nervous and kind of backing away, then that's no good. And she can always leave if she doesn't like what she sees. So he's mimicking a Lewin honeyeater there. They mimic various other species. Those are bellbirds in the background. They're not him mimicking. Can you turn him up a little bit? So he's going to give her a screech, and she's going to freak out and leave. Okay. All right. So now that's in one clay, okay? And this is pretty standard. The other group. The other group that separately evolved bowers, and you see the bower between the male and the female, and it's acting as a separator, much like in the other case. And she's nervous and jumping up and down. So this courtship goes on for a half hour. We won't take you through the whole half hour, but you can see it kind of working with her, calming her down eventually. And they do this kind of around the bower, so you can see the shape of the bower is really dictated by the kind of behaviors of it. And now he's shaking his head a little. Jumps away. Now he's going to do the real courtship's going to start in just a second. And then he's going to do that once more and copulate. And he'll give his little copulation call when he's copulating with her. So bowerbirds really are neat. They're just weird. These little call. All right, he's done. Now, the next one is important because this is that bird, remember I showed you, that didn't have a bower. And this is a tooth-billed bowerbird. And watch what he does. He's courting her. She's going to fly up and he's going to grab her out of the air and copulate with her. So he's basically force copulating. So this is the argument we're making about why bowers exist. If you don't have a bower, as this species does, then the male can force copulate with you. The female can't get away. So just listen to this guy. The bower is moved around here 90 degrees. So he's courting through the wall. He builds a separate see-through wall. This is a spotted bowerbird in one population. Other populations don't do this. But the point is, he's using the bower in a different way. He's modified it so that she stands sideways in it and looks through the wall as he courts her. We think this happens because his displays are so aggressive that it would freak the female out. So he's doing something to kind of calm her down by like putting her in a shark cage so she isn't kind of scared of him quite so much. All right, that's good. We can shut that off and go back to the slides. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so this next bit that I want to show you, the next piece of data, is that what bowerbirds do that's very interesting is they destroy one another's bowers. And what this shows is that males who get their bowers destroyed less tend to have higher reproductive success. In other words, they tend to mate more often. So bower quality is affected by the destructions. Next slide, please. And then we see this kind of relationship between mating success and bower quality. So I want to put this all together in the next slide. And basically what we're arguing here, can we get off that little bit at the top, is that males exploit female wariness when they come into the bower by building a bower to calm females down. And that was the original function of bowers, as a calming device to allow females to come in and look at their display. Destruction of these devices, these bowers, cause males to differ in the quality of their bowers. And then secondarily, females could assess males based on the quality of the construction of their bowers. So this is kind of a three-part model for why bowerbird bowers exist. Right, next slide, please. Now, one thing that we've been working on recently is that there's kind of evidence that intelligence counts if you're a bowerbird. So can you start the video, please? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is an intelligence test. We're giving a male bowerbird, and his task is to remove the top and then remove the red. They hate red on bowers. They love blue, but hate. In fact, we found that they hate red more than they love blue, so that's why we use red in the experiment. And males who do this quicker have higher mating success. And we gave them a panel of tests to run. Back to the slide, please. Thank you. Whoops. Good. So you can see in the figure there that males who do it quicker have higher mating success. Next slide, please. And we gave them a panel of different tasks to do, and we used that to develop a score, an intelligence score. And we found that that intelligence score was related both to male display quality and male mating success. So one could argue that maybe females are assessing males based on their intelligence, and that's an important factor. And some of these tests, in fact, involve bower building traits like single wall destruction. Next slide, please. Now, we also want to talk a little bit about bower decoration. Bower birds really build beautiful bowers, and part of the beauty associated with the bower are the decorations. Now, the interesting thing about spotted bowerbirds is that they have decorations out in front on the edge of the bower, and then they have decorations in the middle. And what we found is that decorations on the outside are important for attracting females into the bower for courtship, and the decorations in the middle are important for securing a copulation. In other words, males with better sets of decorations in the middle tend to have higher courtship success, or the proportion of courtships that actually work and lead to copulations are higher. So males always put their good stuff in the middle. So if they have like lots of wonderful quartz, they'll put that in the middle. Or sometimes they steal human objects. For example, you always find, or you can often find money in the middle. If you have money on a bower, it's right in the middle, various coins. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we see on bowerbird bowers are lots of things that look very artsy. Okay, so they'll put little rings hung in trees. This guy's got a vertebrae stuck between two limbs. This is a bower in Western Australia decorated with pods. And here's a bower where the guy's just thrown everything at the female. He's got green little oranges from a local orchard. He's got decorations hanging on the side of the wall, and then he's got decorations front and back. So it's really an amazing set of decorations. So what we're thinking then is that well, why would they do these things? So we want to put together the idea of that there's intelligence in these birds, but the decorations also have function. So one hypothesis we're working on now is that these particular decorations actually act as markers to allow females to identify particular males and kind of keep them interested while they're watching the courtship display. Next slide, please. Okay, so there is the runaway sexual selection model, which is the alternative, and scientists always like to talk about alternative hypotheses. The problem with the runaway model and just the choice of bowers for aesthetic reasons is that there's not very much good evidence in 30 years since the runaway models have been developed that actually suggest the runaway models actually work. So after a while, you kind of have to give up on hypotheses if nobody can come up with the data. There's a great deal of evidence for functional kinds of explanations, so we think that that's a good reason for pursuing those kinds of explanations. Bowers are explained by a functional approach, bowers in particular, and the co-option model that we talked about. One thing we didn't talk about is that there are variable age preferences in bowerbirds. Young females like different elements of display than older females do, and that doesn't support a runaway kind of model, because what those models require is a kind of technical term, a genetic correlation between the male trait and the female preference, and variable age preferences tend to break that up. And then there's a large role for learning in bowerbird displays. They do a lot of mimicry and things in their courtship, and that's important. And learned traits are probably not very well explained by the runaway model because, again, because of this need for genetic correlations. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to make the argument that function is not the enemy of design or beauty. In other words, you can have beautiful things that are very functional. And we shouldn't try to make that kind of argument. That I have no problem with arguing that bowerbirds do art and that the bowers are beautiful. It's just that we don't need to argue that they're not functional. Next slide. So I want to thank various students and collaborators for our help with the work. And can we end with a click on right here? And this is a very interesting thing that maybe will convince you that you're looking at an artist. Male bowerbirds, if you destroy one wall of their bower, they do something called templating. They'll put the stick in the standing wall and measure it and then use it to put in the other wall that's been destroyed. So thank you very much.